So this lecture titled Makeshift Accommodations in Cities of the Global South is based on my PhD project and ongoing postdoctoral work. And this research is based on 12 months of fieldwork that I conducted in two cities, Dhaka in Bangladesh and Mumbai in India. So broadly, my research focuses on where and how do low-income migrant workers live in cities of the Global South. And before I discuss more on my research and specific examples, here's some context that I wish to share. As you can see on the slide, that the UN report shows that 68% of the world's populations projected to live in urban areas by 2050. And this report also mentions that the size of the world's population is expected to be highly concentrated in just a few countries in the Global South. This is important because cities, on one hand, are essential spaces of growth, opportunities, rural-urban migration, movements, dreams, aspirations. On the other hand, these are also spaces where we find majority of people living with minimal resources, vulnerable conditions in terms of access to housing, but also other kinds of social and economic arrangements. So the UN and other projections emphasizes this aspect that over 1 billion people currently resides in slums or informal settlements. As you can see in the slide, that the data representing total number of people living in slum households in the Global South, out of which estimated 3 billion people will require adequate and affordable housing by 2030. This nature of urbanization reminds us that the urban expansion and growth will transform the urban landscape into high-value land and property. But this rapid transformation will leave certain residents in the Global South hustling for everyday access to housing and other basic services like water, sanitation, and solid waste management. My research, in a way, pays attention to these everyday existence within cities from the context of housing. Before I elaborate more on my research, I just want you all to take a minute to write down in your notebooks few words that comes to mind when you hear the term low-income housing, or that you might associate words with the term low-income housing based on books that you might have read, movies, photographs, reports, or even as a part of your curriculum. Okay. I wonder how many of you have written the word slums, because major part of the discussion on low-income settlement is focused on slums. In literature, movies, photographs, slums have often been depicted as illegal, dangerous, and disordered spaces with horizontal spreads of unplanned squatters and shanty towns. You might have observed this play out in movies or documentaries, but policymakers for decades have debated on the need to remove slums and focus on slum-free cities. Consultants have also worked on finding prescriptive solutions on how to deal with the slum problem. However, we see a contemporary shift in discussion from slum removal to slum redevelopment, acknowledging slums as a part of the larger urban landscape. In this slide, there are a couple of book covers of some popular texts on slums, if you are interested to read more from diverse perspectives, including a historical understanding. My point today is not to talk about what is a slum, but I'll tell you why I find this term unhelpful. Scholars like Alan Gilbert agrees that slums is a dangerous word because it confuses the physical problem of poor quality housing with the characteristics of people living there. This term is a negative stereotype that homogenizes the realities of spaces, people, and their livelihood across the global South. So a major takeaway from this point is to argue that not all low-income housing are slums, and that we need to move beyond this familiar category of slums to understand the complex forms of non-slum housing. Now, the other end of the spectrum in the housing binaries is this conversation around high-rise apartment. So often between slums and high-rise, referred to as two sort of binaries, are often discussed in the context of housing, which is why in this slide, like I have mentioned in the title, I want you all to encourage and reflect on the word in between slums and high-rise. Since in my previous slide, I said that not all low-income housing are slums, there are a variety of housing forms and ways people live in cities that are in between the slums and high-rise. The private rental accommodations where I conducted my research is one such example. I'll give you more examples in the next few slides, but before that, thinking of the term in between, I find the work done by urbanist Gautam Bhan very relevant, where he says that low-income housing is actually a process built not instantly, but over time, brick by brick, extension by extension, and that people continue to live in these houses as they are built. So the housing is not merely an unit measured in census, neither it is a fixed or permanent form, especially in the context of low-income settlements in the global South. And the urban poor often find themselves in between these sort of temporary housing spaces. Based on my research project, I want to emphasize that there are a wide variety of low-income settlements in the global South due to its history, tenure practices, building practices like auto construction and so on. So when I visited the field, I started thinking about low-income housing. At that point, I didn't quite anticipate that my research would lead me to dormitories. During my fieldwork in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, I visited several private rental housing spaces. In the local language, they call it mess bari, which is loosely translated as mess housing. This photograph is from one of the accommodations that I visited in Dhaka for doing my interviews. And this is a 6-storied apartment that has 4 or 5 rooms in every floor. Each of these rooms was shared by at least 4 to 5 workers. And in Mumbai, I also visited several dormitories and other forms of low-income housing where people lived and worked from the same space. Respondents discussed different accommodation options that they had in these big cities. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that I did 12 months of field work where I conducted field observations and interviewed workers living in these accommodations, owners of these rental spaces, wardens of these dormitories, the local builders working on these housing, the day laborers who were also involved in the building process. I also spoke to real estate developers to discuss the housing market, interviewed architects, urban planners, government officials, revenue department officials, historians. So 12 months of field work, 100+ interviews, 2 countries, interviewing and working in 3 different languages. Here I am to share with you some key learnings from the field. The first aspect is that mess accommodations are low-income forms of rental housing that often offer temporary rooms and varied rental arrangements, right from one day where people could just stay for a day or stay for a week, for a month, and even yearly options. These accommodations are instrumental for workers arriving in the city looking for jobs. The residents in the dormitories often work as domestic workers, construction laborers, garment factory workers, rickshaw and car drivers, and small-scale entrepreneurs. And there were separate dormitories for men and women. The rooms themselves were arranged differently from one dormitory to the another. And the most common type of living arrangement was on the floor. There were no beds provided in these dormitories. In accommodations for women, on the other hand, there were sometimes makeshift partitioned walls that was built using temporary materials like cardboard to subdivide the space into separate spaces of living and sleeping and working. Some rooms had big windows, whereas others had blocked windows due to storage. So there were also questions of actual ventilation. These accommodations are characterized by constant trade-offs in the way space is used. For instance, in one of the dormitory units that I visited in Dhaka, the kitchen space was converted into a sleeping area at night to accommodate a group of 4 people. One of the mess owners that I interviewed, he said that, we rent the rooms with no furnitures. People usually adjust on the floor, and that some residents also share kitchen utensils, others would share the cost of groceries or offer to cook meals. The owner's cousin for this particular property was in charge of managing the property, interacting with the residents, collecting rent, facilitating repairs, and responsible for closing the main gate every night. Something like gates were a very important feature because a lot of people opted to live in these spaces for better security, especially women. If you see the photograph in this slide and note the unfinished nature of this particular accommodation, where the top floor is still under construction and that there were several places which were under construction and not fully completed, but people started living. Construction is often completed in a phased manner, depending on the owner, their finances, the local builders. And in a way, this photograph captures that sense of in-betweenness that I mentioned. In between, more as a space of innovation, adaptation, survival, hardships, crisis, and vulnerability. And that this in-between is also historically shaped. And I particularly find the work of scholar like Abdul Malik Simon here very helpful, where he wants us to think about the middle that does not belong to anywhere specific, but yet that specifically act and gather up different sentiments and ways of doing things experimentally when it comes to housing and living arrangements. Another takeaway would be to think about the language of accommodation itself. And why is it that I keep using the word accommodation as opposed to housing? Because what I'm trying to emphasize is that accommodation helps us understand how people are being accommodated in a multiple ways of space making arrangements, but also the link between labor and space. By that, I mean that people living in these accommodations are often the people building these spaces as well. So there is a way of like a precarious nature of housing in terms of dual purpose of work and residence. Accommodation is about these rooms where people are sleeping at night, but it is also about the struggle of finding a place to live in the city. It is about the flows and practices of labor and capital, as in the way city is made and remade through housing practices. The second learning would be to think about multiple arrangements. Here, I just want to give you a brief anecdote from my interview, where the majority of the residents that I encountered throughout my fieldwork frequently moved from one accommodation to the other as they changed between jobs or found a place to work. In this particular slide, I am highlighting story of a worker that I'm calling R now for the sake of our discussion. And during the interview, he showed me the 2-story mess accommodation where he lived. He explained how he ended up being at this dormitory because he arrived in the city 6 years ago from a village, and he chose to live in this neighborhood because it was affordable, and that he used to live in a slum before, but he had to move when there was a fire and he lost all his belongings there, including money. So this accommodation was referred to him by one of his relatives who lived in the village, and he found this particular place really helpful. He said that the residents living here are very friendly. I found the information from a street side poster, but also later on one of my relatives recommended. He works and assists in a business on a part-time basis where he stores and delivers raw materials for garment production. The photograph again here is interesting because this narrative of this individual helps us to see the ways he was looking for different opportunities to do work in the city. At the same time, keep looking for a place to sleep, preferably closer to his place of work. I want you to notice here the storage boxes. Inside R's accommodation, I observed how the storage box in his rooms were moved around. Sometimes they were piled up systematically, sometimes they were arranged in a haphazard manner. There were barely any floor space visible, and the room was so small, full of boxes with garments. And in the other corner of the room, there were some pots and pans, containers of spices and cooking related essentials on the floor. When I asked him that, where do you sleep? He responded that his room was organized differently at night, that he would shift the boxes again and pile them elsewhere. And he used to do this sort of space making exercise every single day, just trying to find a place to sleep in the night. So what I'm saying is that a closer reading of these accommodation spaces helps us to view this kind of built environment through all sorts of makeshift functions, and these visual cues indicate a particular kind of sleeping and working arrangements and adjustments that these individuals had to go through. The third point is about another accommodation that I visited where the workers used to focus on embroidery work. So there were no windows in their room, but there were several bright tube lights. And one of them mentioned that, we need these lights for our embroidery work because it is easier for us to see the threads clearly, focus on the task, and work better. And that they switch off the majority of the lights when they are not using. To me, these bright lights made the accommodation look like a factory line at a certain point in the day. Yet when the lights were turned off and the mattresses were out, the space was transformed into a place of sleeping and housing. So there were also instances where I observed rolled up mattresses kept behind the door, giving me a sense of how their sleeping and cooking and working arrangements are distributed throughout the day. And that gives us a sense of the practices of making and strategies of shifting in low-income rental accommodation. I just want to quickly wrap up this presentation by saying that the makeshift nature of housing is actually about these constant trade-offs in the way space is used. And the makeshift functions and these visual cues, be it the boxes or the lights or the clothesline that you saw in the photographs, indicate these sleeping and working arrangements inside these dense housing spaces, which are examples of resilience, knowledge, economic growth, rather than only vulnerability or illegality, because of these sort of interconnections, joint histories, ways of coping, and paying attention to this particular process of how people are living. I also use the word makeshift to highlight the journeys between cities, but also between these lives that are lived in them. So the journeys of their routine life that is makeshift and constantly in between, which is why my research focused on these questions like, where are people being accommodated? How is it being built and governed? And how are these spaces changing what cities are and what they will become? What I discussed in the previous slides through examples is that accommodation is layered with questions of tenure, materials, politics, the physical space, structure of the house, administrative categories, and lived realities. So I just want to conclude this talk by re-emphasizing on this important takeaway that these kinds of low-income housing accommodations are temporary and transient in nature, that there is more to housing than just slums and high-rise. We need to think about what's in between, and which is why my focus on housing explored this kind of concrete and fixed space, which is produced and given multiple forms on the ground. I propose to go beyond the understanding of slums as low-income built spaces and instead look at accommodations and the makeshift process as a starting point for thinking about cities in the global south that are often fluid and unfinished in nature, intertwined with work, materiality, and these sorts of globalized flows. I'm going to stop here and see if you all have any questions for discussion.
Hi, Shreyashi. Do you want to just stop sharing your screen so then we can just sort of see each other a bit better? Perfect. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I've got a couple of questions to start us off with. One, student wants to know, how did you become interested in this particular part of human geography?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, I was interested in looking at cities and questions of urban issues. There were multiple reasons why I became interested in housing specifically. I did some work on low-income settlements before, but I have also personally lived in state-built housing in India. So a lot of my experiences of doing research comes from both some of the lived realities of spaces that I have lived, inhabited, seen, but also experienced and researched living in these cities.
And Artemis asks, how did you decide to study geography in the first place?
I have to say that I have interdisciplinary background. So I have studied geography partly, but I also come into this research from questions of development studies, a little bit of methodological issues around from like borrowing from multiple disciplines. But I find human geography interesting because it gives me a space to bring in multiple disciplines and make these conversations between people and spaces and practices from various perspectives.
Yeah, which is also one of the beautiful things about geography, isn't it? It's that melting pot of all those different sort of, or the cross section of quite a few different disciplines. Rachel asks, how much, so in your research and the people that you spoke to, how much did they get paid? And do you know how much of that was going towards rent?
Yeah, I think that would vary in terms of if I were to specify a particular like a figure of how much they were getting paid, depending on their job. Sometimes people did multiple jobs, so they would be paid different amounts. Some people would prefer working in the day and also in the night to get some extra income. Some of them would also rent their own housing spaces to kind of get more rent. So they had like varied sources of income. But the percentage they were spending on living was pretty less. I would say not more than 10% of their income, but some of them ended up spending more if they were moving frequently between places.
Okay, thank you. So Jack asked, did you notice any significant differences between the cities of Dhaka and Mumbai?
Yeah, definitely. And this is what I found interesting in doing comparative research. The challenges of comparing two cities, but also noticing how these places were distinct in its own ways because of their history and how some of these places were built. Because the point is, none of these places were, there was a story behind all of these accommodations where I looked at, and I think those were pretty distinct in between these two cities, apart from the historical context.
And a follow-up to that, how did you choose Mumbai and Dhaka? So what were some of sort of the methodological reasons behind choosing those two?
Yeah, great question again. I think I chose those two cities partly because I was looking at South Asian cities. They were similar in different ways in terms of density, questions of real estate, the kind of challenges related to housing that these two cities faced. Also, language. I sort of spoke the language in these two places that was also another rationale of interacting with residents here.
Okay, yeah. And then someone asks, do you think that your findings, could that be applicable to anywhere in the global north?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm glad you asked this because I did an exhibition a couple of years back in Cambridge where I was making some references with the beds in sheds in the UK, where people would convert their sheds into beds and migrant workers living in different kinds of conditions in these places. And I was drawing parallels between in general, like how workers live in different cities of the global north, including the UK. And if you are interested, might be worth looking at the beds and sheds case and different articles around it that's been covered.
Yeah. Austin asks, was there a sense, so with sort of these dormitories or sort of intermediate accommodation, was there a strong sense of community?
Yeah, I think there was, because people were affiliated because of their cultural backgrounds, including questions of languages, religion, caste, and several other affinity factors that mattered why some of them chose to live with in certain accommodations. Some people would also choose who their roommates are based on some of these factors. There was definitely some kind of affinity, even if these were temporary and long-term in certain cases.
And then I'm going to lump some questions together, or try to lump some questions together in one. So we've got a couple of questions around sort of sustainability and the future of housing. And essentially, do you think that ultimately urban development is going to shift more towards this sort of form of housing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to this. I mean, the way how I see this question of sustainable housing practices is that most of our policies on housing has a black and white approach to how it perceives housing, as opposed to acknowledging ways how people are already living, and in a way to give more importance to a particular standardized form. Which is why I think the idea through my research is also to kind of encourage policymakers to think about housing more holistically and to acknowledge varied forms of housing, and not to kind of look at it as if there are only two kinds, like either the slums that should be removed or the high rises that are here to stay. All I'm saying is the question of sustainability is important because we need to look at ways how people are already living and acknowledging those sorts of forms and building on that.
I'm going to be cheeky and ask a follow-up question for myself. Sorry, everyone who's asked questions that, the perks of power, hey. In your interviews that you conducted, was there a sense, did they themselves want to progress into a high-rise accommodation? So was there sort of the ambition to be like, well, where I am living now is possibly better than a slum, as we would think of it, but ultimately in X amount of time, if I can save X amount of money, I would like to move up to sort of like the next level of housing?
Yeah, I think some of them definitely had that sort of aspirations, and some of them were even successful in doing that. But I think they also mentioned that they found themselves in a circular process, in the way that sometimes if they moved up in a better place and let's say they were cheated by the landlord, or they had instances where their housing was caught on fire because of bad building practices, so they found themselves back again, and they had to start from scratch rebuilding their lives in these cities. So none of them, I would say, is a linear process where you start from a slum and then you aim to or you aspire to live in a high-rise settlement. In fact, a lot of the other kind of housing-related discussions suggest that even if people are moved into high-rises, sometimes that coincides with their livelihood practices, that they can't live in a high-rise settlement and practice the same kind of livelihood that requires them the access to the street. So that is also an important part of the discussion.
And we've got a couple of questions again. I'm sort of going to blob them together. So I apologize if I don't get quite the nuance that someone has asked specifically. But there are quite a few questions around the role of government and sort of the broader sort of a societal or cultural approach to it. I mean, sort of in your research, have you found that the government promotes intermediate housing? Do they sort of accept it as it's naturally going to occur? And is there anything that if a government, so, at a sort of a national level in India or a state level in India, is there anything the government can do to essentially not have this intermediate housing?
Yeah, so the question in housing from the government's perspective is that they focus mainly on ownership-based housing, right? And as you might have noticed in my research, I focused on rental housing. And even within rental housing, I focused on private housing, the ones that are not built by the state, because I felt like that is where not a whole lot of research has not focused on this kind of private rental housing models and what's happening in this space, especially in the low-income housing, from the low-income housing perspective. I think there's been now some kind of discussions around building housing for migrant workers. There has to be more acknowledgement of the floating population that we have in cities, that not everybody is living in cities permanently. So that was one of my important finding and thought to what this can add up to the government's perspective. Another interesting point is that I interviewed some revenue officials whose job was to collect taxes from different rental accommodations. This is another methodological perspective that I incorporated in my research, where I was shadowing some of the tax collectors who were mainly street level bureaucrats who were roaming around in these neighborhoods collecting taxes. That's a research paper that I'm currently working on, if you all are interested at some point. The dynamics between officials sitting in offices, but also the street level bureaucrats dealing with these rental accommodations on a day-to-day basis.
So did you say you are currently doing that research paper? Okay, that would be, yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
A question here. How do you think climate change will affect these communities and the buildings they live in?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. Um, I think one, definitely the building practices, because not these accommodations may not withstand to the climate related pressures, especially in a region like Bangladesh, which is known for the ways that climate affects some of the landscape, but also questions of water, like a lot of my residents spoke during flooding. They had problems as to how they would navigate the ground floor of these housing spaces, the different ways they were trying to like just deal with the months, the monsoon months where there'll be rainfall and everything. So I think climate change, both in terms of the building practices, the materials that were used, sometimes inside these houses, but also how people were dealing and with these climate related challenges on certain months in a year.
So again, an interesting question, certainly, I think, is with the people that you were interviewing, would you say that they were happy? Or I suppose to make it possibly to narrow it down, were they happy with their accommodation or their accommodation situation?
Yeah, I have to say, so again, this is going to be my version, right? Or how I interpret that conversation. I don't think I can certainly say as to what is that emotion or if it can be called happy, but some of them were satisfied with the accommodations that they were living in because it helped them reach their work at time, not spend money in transportation, have a secured living with somebody monitoring and opening these gates and letting them stay in a particular place, away from other kinds of legal hassles. So there were certain factors that made them stay there. And when sometimes it did not match their requirements, they would move to another location. So in the conversations that I had in the spaces, they did mention lots of challenges, but they also gave rationale as to why they prefer living there.
And another question, another couple of questions actually about sort of the sense of community. And again, do you feel, you might not be able to say either way, but do you feel that there was a stronger sense of community in this sort of in-between accommodation compared to high-rise, or even by extension, was there less of a sense of community compared to what we might think of as pure slum housing?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to this in a way that, because I haven't done research on high rises or slums, but definitely from the literature that I read on sense of community, that yeah, the accommodations that I visited, definitely people felt like there was a bond, especially in times when they would fall sick and they will have their roommates kind of, getting them the basics that they might need, which also means that some of them had to miss their work and stay at home in case somebody needs them. But I think there's that strong sense of bonding because they felt like, they had to care for each other because there was nothing else available as such. Some of them also had employers who would take care of them. So there's definitely some sort of relationships between the roommates, between the employers, between the landowner and these, the caretakers who would take care of these accommodations. So I think we are talking about multiple sort of stakeholders and the sense of ownership. I mean, all I'm trying to say is that community has to be broken down in between like who these individuals might be. So, yeah.
And also, I suppose from what you said earlier about there's for some people there's a cyclical process about how they're moving through it. So we're all, I suppose you're cautioning against us thinking about them as being sort of fixed long-term communities, because there is always a churn, of people moving, up into or coming out, and which might mitigate against sort of the creation of like a really strong sense of community. Someone also asks, how geographically distinct are they within cities? So do you tend to get, I guess what they're asking is, do you get sort of like a large zone of sort of in between housing, or does it sort of spring up in pockets, so to speak?
It certainly springs in between pockets, depending on the land value and which part of the city. Is it in the suburbs or is it in the main centers? Where are these growing? So the question of availability of land and what is high value land. But I think this idea also changes over time, because the area that used to be a suburb now becomes like a prime property in the city. So people are pushed again to move elsewhere, and that these accommodations might come up in a different kind of places. I found it actually difficult to locate them just by looking at the structure from the outside, because all of them blends so well with the overall landscape of these two cities that it's harder to actually pinpoint and say, is this an accommodation or not? Because this might be a rental housing, but what goes inside these housing, until and unless we kind of go check these processes, it's hard to kind of see them from the outside and understand it. So it's pretty well blended, like within the landscape.
Interesting. So we're getting towards the end. So there's lots more unanswered questions. So I apologize if we don't get to them, and I am trying to group them as we go along. So an interesting one and this is from Kira. Even though you've been studying and researching these makeshift accommodations for a long time, was there anything that still shocked you when you went to do your research?
I'm glad like you asked. There is one thing that I still haven't quite understood why or how. In this, there was this one instance where a worker lost his job, and he was trying to make money from the housing space he was living. So he decided that for a couple of days he will rent out his space to another friend of his who was looking for a house, and he would live in his factory where he was working or on streets. And when he said that, it kept reminding me that, if he's sleeping on streets a couple of days, it's not like he was homeless, but, he was just doing it because he was looking for a job, but he still needed the money to eat and, live for those couple of days. So those sorts of interesting dynamics. And also one of the respondents put their accommodation on Airbnb to rent it out for a couple of days, which also made me think that, we would think of Airbnbs as a particular kind of accommodation, but what happens when you see these sorts of mess accommodations being put out in places like Airbnb, and what does it tell us about like short-term rental housing spaces, but also like low-income housing spaces that come from these cities of the global south? So I think those are sort of puzzles that I'm still grappling with to try and figure out where is it that we put these puzzles in the housing question.
Thank you. I think that's a nice point to end on. And again, sorry everyone who asked questions and we didn't get to them. There were lots of very good ones. We could talk all day, but unfortunately we don't have all time. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to say thank you very much, Dr. Dasgupta. Thank you for your talk.